My wife looked at me and said, "I need freedom to feel alive again." I nodded, packed quietly, took the opportunity I'd ignored for years, and left without drama. Months later, she realized silence changes the story more than arguments ever could. "I need freedom to feel alive again." She said it the way people say things they've been rehearsing in the shower for weeks. Calm, measured, like she'd already decided what my answer was going to be before she finished the sentence. I was standing in the kitchen doorway, still in my work clothes, a mug of coffee going cold in my hand. She was sitting at the dining table, both palms flat on the wood, like she needed the surface to stay steady. And she looked at me, not with anger, not with tears, with this exhausted kind of certainty that I hadn't seen on her face before. "I feel trapped," she said. "Not by you specifically, just by all of this." She gestured vaguely at the apartment, at the life we'd built, at the 6 years of it sitting between us like furniture nobody moved anymore. I didn't say anything. I just looked at her, and somewhere in the back of my chest, something I'd been carrying for a very long time quietly put itself down. Hey viewers, before we move on to the video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if you want to see more stories like this. I was 34. She was 32. We'd been married for 4 years, together for 6. No kids yet, which had been a conversation we kept postponing like a dentist appointment neither of us wanted to schedule. We lived in a mid-sized apartment in a city that had been her idea originally. She'd gotten a design position here, a good one, and I'd followed because I loved her and because my own work as a technical writer could be done from anywhere. That was the version of the story we told people. The version we told ourselves was a little more complicated. I want to be honest about something before I go any further. I was not a perfect husband. I wasn't absent. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't unfaithful. But I was quiet in a way that made her feel alone in rooms I was physically present in. I was consistent in a way that eventually started to feel like indifference. I was stable in a way she later described as suffocating. I heard all of that over the years, piece by piece, in arguments that escalated quickly and resolved slowly. I remembered the first time she'd used the word suffocating. It was about 18 months into the marriage. We'd been at a dinner party, friends of hers from the design world, people who spoke loudly and interrupted each other with enthusiasm and drank wine like it was a competitive sport. I'd sat next to her and been polite and engaged and present in the way I knew how to be. And on the drive home she'd said, without looking at me, "Sometimes I feel like you put a ceiling on every room you're in." I'd asked what she meant. She said, "You're so controlled, so measured. It makes everything feel smaller." I thought about that for days, genuinely turned it over, tried to understand what was being asked of me. And eventually I decided she meant I should take up more space, be louder, be more spontaneous. So I tried that for a while, and she told me it felt performative. I went back to being myself. She said that felt like withdrawal. This was the pattern. Not fighting exactly, just this endless renegotiation of who I was supposed to be, and me never quite landing on the version she needed, and both of us slowly getting tired in a way that neither of us talked about directly. And I tried to change. I genuinely did. I signed up for a cooking class because she said I never put in effort. I planned a trip to Portugal because she said I was too passive about making memories. I left notes in her bag. I booked dinner reservations. I put my phone down during conversations. I started asking more questions, which she said she appreciated for about 3 weeks before calling it exhausting. I started talking more about my own feelings, which lasted until one evening when she said, gently but clearly, that she didn't have the bandwidth for my processing right now. I went back to being quieter. She said that felt like shutting down. I couldn't win, not because she was trying to make me lose, but because we were playing 2 different games and had been for a long time. She wanted to feel something electric. I wanted to feel something safe. And neither of us had said those things out loud, not clearly, not without the static of argument around them. But here's the thing nobody tells you about trying in a marriage. Effort that isn't recognized doesn't feel like effort after a while. It just feels like silence. And silence, when you've been doing it long enough, starts to feel a lot like giving up. That night, after she said what she said, I poured the cold coffee down the sink. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask her what she meant. I didn't do what I'd done in every argument for 6 years, which was to take whatever she'd thrown at me and pull it apart carefully, trying to find the part one was responsible for, trying to fix it, trying to be better. I just rinsed the mug, set it on the drying rack, and said, "Okay." She blinked. "Okay," she repeated. "Okay," I said again. I walked past her into the bedroom. I didn't slam the door. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a while, and I thought about a phone call I'd gotten 3 weeks earlier that I hadn't told her about. His name was Derek. We'd worked together years ago at a content firm in another city, before I moved here, before her, before all of this. Derek had gone on to build something interesting. A small but growing communications consultancy that worked with mid-sized tech companies, and he'd been slowly, methodically offering me a senior position for the better part of 2 years. The money was good. The role was better. The location was the problem. It was 1,200 miles away. Different time zone. Different life. Every time he called, I'd listen politely, asked a few questions to seem engaged, and then told him I'd think about it. Then I'd think about it for exactly 48 hours before setting it aside, because Claire would have to leave her job, her friendships, her city, and I wasn't going to ask her to do that. So I said no. And he called again, patient the way people are when they really want something. And I said no again. The third time, 3 weeks before she sat at that table with her palms flat and her voice rehearsed, Derek had called and said this was the last time he was asking. He had a board meeting coming up. He needed an answer in 2 weeks. I told him I'd call him back. I hadn't. I sat in the dark on the edge of our bed and thought about 2 weeks. Then I thought about what she'd said. I need freedom to feel alive again. I turned it over slowly. She wasn't asking me to fight for her. She wasn't asking me to collapse. She wasn't even asking me to leave, not explicitly. But she was telling me something true. And the truest version of it was this. She had already made a decision. She was just waiting to see if I'd argue with it, the way I'd argued with everything for 6 years, pulling threads, asking questions, trying to understand, trying to fix. And if I argued, she'd feel justified. And if I didn't argue, she'd feel released. Either way, the outcome was the same. I just had to decide which version of the ending I was walking into. I called Derek the next morning from my car before I went inside the office. He picked up on the second ring. "Tell me the position is still open," I said. A pause. Then, "It is. I need a week to sort out logistics," I said. "You have it," he said. "One condition." "Name it." "I need to start remotely for the first month while I find a place." "Done," he said. I sat in the parking garage for a few minutes after we hung up. The engine was off. It was quiet. For the first time in a long time, the quiet didn't feel like a problem I needed to solve. I want you to understand something about the week that followed. There was no dramatic confrontation. There was no single conversation where I told her I was leaving. What there was a slow and deliberate unwinding that I think she mistook for something else entirely. She came home that first evening to find me cooking, not because I was trying to win her back, but because I'd realized I actually liked cooking, and I'd spent the last 3 years abandoning things I liked in order to seem more present without actually being present. She sat at the counter and watched me. "Are you upset?" she asked. "No," I said. "You seem different." "I feel different," I said honestly. She didn't know what to do with that. So she got up and went to the other room. On the third day, I called my sister Nora. We hadn't talked properly in months, which was my fault entirely. She answered with, "I was starting to wonder if you died." I laughed. It was the first real laugh I'd had in a while. "I'm leaving," I told her. A long pause. "Her?" she asked. "The city," I said. "And her?" A shorter pause. "That too." Nora didn't immediately offer me comfort. She didn't say "I told you so" either, which I appreciated because she absolutely had, twice, in very gentle terms that I'd brushed off. What she said was, "Where are you going?" I told her about Derek, about the job, about the city, about the apartment listings I'd already been quietly looking at on my phone during lunch breaks. "Do you need a place to land first?" she asked. "I have enough saved," I said. "I know you have enough saved," she said. "I'm asking if you need somewhere familiar." I thought about that. "Not yet," I said. "But maybe for a weekend, before I go." "Done," she said. Simple as that. On the 5th day, something shifted in the apartment. Claire had been watching me, not in an obvious way, but I'd catch her glancing over when I was reading, or standing in the hallway for a moment longer than necessary when I walked past. That evening she said, "You're not going to fight me on this, are you?" I looked up from the book I was reading. "On what?" I asked. She gestured vaguely, the same way she had at the dining table. "At the apartment. At everything." "I don't think fighting would help either of us," I said. She stood there for a moment. "Most people would at least ask questions," she said. "What would you like me to ask?" I said. She didn't answer. She went to bed. I stayed up and finished the chapter. On the 6th day, I started packing. Not dramatically. Not in the living room where she could see and it could become something. I packed in the mornings, before she woke up, and I kept the boxes in the storage unit down the block. Clothes first, then books, which was the longest part because I had 4 full shelves and I wanted to be honest with myself about which ones I'd actually read again and which ones I kept for show. I left the ones that were hers or ours. I left the picture frames. I left the small things that had accumulated in the corners of a shared life. The coffee table book she'd bought in Lisbon, the ceramic bowl from a farmer's market, the wind chime outside the balcony door that she'd hung up and I'd never once commented on. But I did pause at the wind chime. I stood there in the early morning light with a box in my arms and looked at it. She'd bought it on a trip she took with Mia 2 summers back when I'd stayed home because of a project deadline. She'd come back sunburned and talkative and had hung the wind chime without asking me if I liked it, which at the time I'd noticed and said nothing about. It caught a draft from the balcony door and turned slowly. I left it. It was hers. But standing there, I realized I was also leaving the version of myself that would have quietly resented it. The version that cataloged small asymmetries. The version that kept score without ever showing the card. That version could stay too. I took the things that were mine. Only mine. And there were, I realized, fewer of those than I expected. That told me something. Not about her. About how much of myself I had quietly set aside over the years. The way you set aside something you mean to come back to, and then one day realize you've simply stopped thinking about it. There was one other thing I took. At the back of the closet, behind winter coats and a bag of sports equipment that neither of us had touched in 2 years, there was a cardboard box. My box. The one I'd brought to the apartment when we'd first moved in together, full of things from before, photographs, notebooks, a few small objects with meaning only I knew. Claire had once, early in the relationship, gone through it with me. We'd spent an afternoon on the floor with wine, and she'd asked about each thing, and I'd told her. It had been one of the best afternoons of that first year. I opened the box now in the quiet of the pre-dawn apartment. The photographs were still there. A notebook from my early 20s when I'd been trying, briefly and earnestly, to write fiction. A small carved wooden figure my father had given me before he died, which was 12 years ago now, and which I thought about less and less, and then, sometimes, all at once. I sat cross-legged on the closet floor and held the wooden figure for a minute. Then I put everything back in the box, sealed it with tape, and carried it to the storage unit. This box was mine, had always been mine, and I was taking it with me this time. On the 7th day, I told her, not with ceremony. I waited until after dinner, when she was reading on the couch and I was standing near the window. I'm moving out at the end of next week, I said. She lowered the book. You found an apartment? She asked. I found a job, I said. I'm relocating. A beat. When did this happen? I've had the offer for 2 years, I said. I kept saying no. She stared at me. 2 years, she repeated. I didn't want to disrupt your life, I said. So I put it down every time it came up. She set the book aside. She said nothing for a long moment. Then, where? I told her. She looked at the window. That's far, she said. Yes, I said. Another long silence. Do you want me to? She started. No, I said quietly. That's not what I'm doing. She nodded slowly. I went back to the bedroom. She stayed on the couch. I want to pause here and be very precise about something, because I've thought about this a lot in the months since. I was not leaving to punish her. I was not executing some calculated silence as revenge strategy. I was not playing a long game. What I was doing was something much simpler and much more difficult. I was finally listening to her. She said she needed freedom to feel alive again. I believed her, and I understood, maybe for the first time in 6 years, that the most loving thing I could do in that moment was to not make my response about what I wanted. She didn't want an argument. She didn't want a negotiation. She didn't want me to tell her what I needed or what I was feeling or what I thought we could fix together. She wanted space. She wanted out. And I had somewhere to go. So I went. The last morning was a Tuesday. The movers, just one guy with a van, I'd kept it simple, came at 8. Claire had stayed the night, but she left early, before the van arrived. I don't know if that was deliberate. I think it probably was. She left a note on the counter. It said, I hope you find what you're looking for. I read it twice. Then I folded it and put it in my jacket pocket. Not as a keepsake. Just because I didn't want to leave it on the counter like it hadn't meant anything. The apartment looked different with my things gone. Larger. More echo in the rooms. Her furniture, her art, her books, they were all still there. But the things that had quietly pressed against them, the weight of my presence in the corners and on the shelves, those were gone now. I stood in the doorway for a moment. I didn't feel like crying. I felt like someone who'd been holding a door shut against strong wind for years, who had finally just opened it and let the wind move through. Not defeat, just release. Derek had arranged a short-term furnished rental for the first month. It was a studio, small, clean, near the office. I unpacked in about 3 hours. There was almost nothing to arrange. A few boxes of clothes, a bag of books, my laptop, a photograph of Nora and me from a hiking trip we'd taken 5 or 6 years ago, which I kept in my desk drawer at the old apartment, out of sight, because Claire had once made a passing comment about how much of my apartment used to be centered around your family before she moved in. I set it on the windowsill. Then I made coffee. Then I sat at the small desk by the window and looked at the street below and thought, this is mine. Not accusingly, just noting it. This is mine. The first month was quiet. I started working properly, which sounds strange, but I mean it. For years I'd been technically functional, meeting deadlines, keeping clients satisfied, getting performance reviews that said reliable and thorough and never exceptional. Because exceptional takes a kind of engagement that I hadn't had for a long time. It takes presence, and I'd spent my presence elsewhere, trying to fill the silence in a marriage that didn't want to be filled. At Derek's consultancy, the work was harder and faster and more demanding. I was writing strategy documents, managing client communications, building a documentation framework from the ground up. I stayed late because I wanted to. I came in early because the problems were interesting. I had a colleague named Victor who sat across from me and had the useful habit of arguing with every document I produced, not out of obstruction, but out of a genuine belief that ideas should be tested before they're trusted. We went back and forth daily on frameworks and language and structure, and those arguments felt like the most honest conversations I'd had in years. Not because they were deep, because they were just about the work. No subtext, no emotional accounting. Just, here's what I think, here's why, push back if you disagree. I thrived in it. More than I expected. More than I probably would have believed if you told me 6 months earlier. Derek noticed. One Friday afternoon he stopped at my desk and said, "You know, I've been trying to get you here for 2 years. I'm glad I was patient." "So am I said. And I meant it in more ways than he knew. I didn't call Claire. She didn't call me. We had a few practical text exchanges in the first 2 weeks. She needed to know which utility bills were in my name. I needed to give her the forwarding address for my mail. Brief. Functional. After that, nothing. I think she expected me to check in, to ask how she was doing, to reach out after a few days of silence the way I had always reached out after every argument, knocking softly on whatever door she'd closed between us, asking if we could talk. I didn't. Not because I was angry, not because I was making a point, but because I was learning, slowly and a little painfully, that reaching out had always been my way of managing my own discomfort with silence. It had never actually been about her. An understanding that changed something in me. Around the 6-week mark, her friend Mia texted me. Mia was Claire's closest friend from college. Sharp, funny, someone I'd always liked even during the years when Claire and I were at our worst. The text said, "Hey, I know it's not my place, but she's struggling." I stared at it for a while. Then I typed back, "I hope she finds what she's looking for." The same words she'd written to me. Not as a jab, just because they felt true in both directions. Mia replied, "Okay, fair enough." Then after a pause, "For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing." I put my phone down and went back to work. The second month, I found a proper apartment. 2nd floor, 1 bedroom, a small balcony that looked out over a park. I bought furniture slowly and deliberately. A bed I actually liked. A desk that was better than anything I'd had in 6 years of sharing a space. A bookshelf, finally, with enough room for everything instead of the overcrowded corner I'd been allocated at the old place. I hung nothing on the walls for the first 3 weeks. Not because I didn't have things, because I wanted to sit with blank walls for a while, to notice what felt missing and what felt fine. It was a small thing, probably meaningless to anyone else. But for someone who had spent years trying to fit into a space that had been gradually shaped around someone else's preferences, it mattered. The blank walls were mine. The decision to eventually fill them, or not, was mine. On a Saturday about 3 weeks in, I went to a weekend market in the neighborhood and found a print by a printmaker I'd never heard of, bold lines, limited color, something about the composition that I couldn't articulate but that I wanted to look at. I bought it, hung it above the desk, stood back and looked at it, and thought, yes, that's the right thing. For no reason other than I thought so. It was the most uncomplicated purchase I'd made in years. I cooked dinner most nights. I took long walks in the park below on weekends. I called Nora every Sunday, which became a ritual that surprised both of us with how easy it was. I hadn't realized, until I had space to think about it, how much of myself I'd compressed over the years to fit into a shared life that was increasingly designed for one person. I was not happy in some shining, obvious way. I was something quieter than that. I was becoming recognizable to myself again. At the end of the second month, Claire called. I was in the kitchen when my phone lit up with her name. I stood there for one ring, then two. Then I picked up. Hey, she said. Hey, I said. A pause. How are you, she asked. Good, I said. How are you? I'm adjusting, she said. To the space. I asked. A longer pause. To all of it, she said. I waited. She said. It's quieter than I expected. I didn't say anything to that. She said. I thought I'd feel more. More what? I asked. Free, she said. And the word hung there between us on the line. The word she'd used that night in the kitchen. The word that had started all of this. I listened to her breathe for a moment. Then I said, I think freedom feels different in the wanting of it than it does in the having of it. She was quiet. Are you okay? She asked eventually. I am, I said. Actually, yes. Another pause. I meant the note, she said. I know, I said. I meant it too. She called again 2 weeks later. This time it wasn't quiet and measured. This time there was an urgency in her voice that I hadn't heard in years. I made a mistake, she said. No preamble. Straight into it. I sat down. Tell me what you mean by that. I said carefully. I thought I needed room to breathe, she said. But it's been 2 months and I just feel. She stopped. What? I asked. Alone, she said. I feel alone. I let that sit for a moment. Claire, I said. I have to be honest with you. Please, she said. You told me something true that night. You said you felt trapped. You said you needed freedom to feel alive again. And I believe you. I believe that was real. But, she started. Let me finish, I said gently. What I think is also true is that you expected me to argue, to chase, to try to renegotiate what we had. And when I didn't, when I just listened and left, I think it surprised you. And maybe that surprise feels, right now, like it means something it doesn't. A long silence. You think I'm just reacting to the silence, she said. I think you might be, I said. But I could be wrong. I'm not inside your head. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then, quietly, I miss you. I closed my eyes. I miss who we were a long time ago, I said. I don't think I miss what we'd become. She didn't argue with that. I think because some part of her knew it was true. I want to tell you about a conversation I had with Derek around this time. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was the opposite of dramatic. It was a Tuesday afternoon. We were in his office after a client call, and he was pouring coffee, and out of nowhere he said, You doing okay? Personal stuff, I mean. I know you went through something when you came here. I considered how to answer. I think I made decisions for a long time that were based on who I thought I should be, I said. And I stopped making them that way. He nodded. Rough adjustment? Less than I expected, I said. That mean you regret it, or you don't? Neither, I said. It means I should have done it earlier. He handed me a mug. Funny how long people wait, he said. Yeah, I said. It is. 3 months in, Claire asked if we could talk properly. Not a phone call. In person. She offered to fly out. I thought about that for a while before I responded. I thought about what in person meant. I thought about how good I'd been at being in a room with her and not really being there. I thought about the version of me who would have said yes immediately because saying yes was easier than sitting with the discomfort of saying no. I texted back. I don't think that's a good idea right now. She called 20 minutes later. Why not? She asked. And it didn't sound hurt. It sounded genuinely confused, the way she used to sound in the early years when she was actually trying to understand me rather than win. Because I think we'd fall into old patterns, I said. Which ones? She asked. You'd want to explain. I'd want to understand. We'd spend 12 hours talking and leave more tangled than we arrived. A pause. That's not entirely fair, she said. No, I said. You're right. It's not entirely fair. But it's honest. She said. I've started therapy. I sat with that. How is it? I asked. Hard, she said. The therapist keeps asking me what I want. Not what I'm reacting to. What I actually want. And I asked. I'm working on it, she said. I respected that she said it without the usual gloss. Good, I said. And I meant it. There's a thing that happens when you stop being the person who fights for a relationship. Not stops caring. Just stops fighting. People who loved you from a distance sometimes step in to fill the gap. Claire's mother called me once, about 3 months in. We'd always had a decent relationship, warm but not close. She called on a Wednesday, and she said, I don't know what happened between you two, and I'm not asking. But I want you to know that I see you. And I think whatever you did it cleanly. I didn't know what to say to that. I tried, I said. I know, she said. She needed to figure something out. I just hope she figures it out for the right reasons and not the wrong ones. I thought about that for a long time after. What are the right reasons? The wrong ones? I think what she meant was this. Running towards something is different from running away from the consequences of what you said when you thought no one was actually going to move. And only Claire could know which one she was doing. For months after I left, I got a long email from her. Not a text, an email, which felt deliberate. The kind of deliberate that comes from writing something and rewriting it and editing it and deciding this is the version. I'm going to tell you what she said, not word for word, but the shape of it. She said she had spent the first month after I left feeling, essentially, validated. She had space. The apartment was hers. Her schedule was hers. Her evenings were hers. And she'd felt, in those first few weeks, exactly what she thought she'd feel. Lighter. She said she started going out more, seeing friends she'd neglected, taking on projects she'd been putting off. She said she felt alive in a way she hadn't in a long time. She wanted me to know that part. That what she'd said was real. Then she said, somewhere in the second month, the lightness started to feel different. Not heavy exactly, just hollow. She said she kept expecting to want something specific and not finding it. She'd go out with friends and come home to the quiet apartment and sit on the couch and feel like she'd missed a step in the dark. She said she started to wonder, for the first time, whether what she had needed was freedom from the relationship, or whether what she'd needed was freedom inside herself, and she'd aimed it at me because I was the closest target. She said her therapist had used the phrase redirected longing, and it had taken her 3 sessions to stop being defensive about it, and another 2 to understand what it meant in her own life. She said she wasn't writing to ask me to come back. She was writing because she owed me an honest account of what she'd found when she got what she'd asked for. She said, "You were never the cage. I built the cage. You were just there when I finally looked up and saw the bars." She said she was sorry, not for wanting freedom, for the way she'd announced it. Like it was a sentence she was passing on me rather than a truth she was trying to reach toward. She said she'd talked to Mia, and Mia, being Mia, had been direct with her in a way she hadn't been prepared for. Mia had said, "You've been auditioning husbands your whole life. The problem is you keep casting the role and then rewriting the character." Claire said she'd been angry at that for a week. Then she'd realized it wasn't wrong. She said she hoped I was well. She said she was glad I had somewhere to go. She said, "Silence changes things more than arguments ever could, doesn't it?" I understand that now. I read the email in my apartment on a Saturday morning. The park below was full of people. I sat there for a long time with the coffee going cold in my hand, which felt, somehow, like the right place to end up. I wrote back, "I want to be honest about that, because the narrative version of this story might want me to have stayed silent. Return the lesson. Let the email sit unanswered as its own kind of answer. But that's not who I am, or not who I want to be." I wrote back and I told her thank you. Not sarcastically. I told her that what she'd written took courage, and that I believed her. I told her that I didn't think she was a villain in this story, and I hoped she didn't think I was either. I told her that some relationships reach a point where they've been the wrong shape for so long that the people inside them start to become the wrong shape too. And sometimes the kindest thing 2 people can do for each other is stop trying to bend themselves back into something that stopped fitting years ago. I told her I didn't regret the 6 years. I told her I didn't regret leaving. I told her both of those things were true at the same time. I told her I hoped therapy was giving her something real. And I told her that if she ever needed to talk, not about us, not about what happened, just talk, the way 2 people who shared 6 years of their lives can sometimes talk, I was reachable. Then I put my phone in my jacket pocket, and I went down to the park. I walked for a long time that morning. The city was still new enough to me that streets had the quality of discovery. I took a route I hadn't taken before, past a neighborhood of older buildings with wide front steps and window boxes. I found a bench near a small pond and sat there for a while. There were kids throwing bread at ducks, which the ducks were enthusiastically encouraging. An older man walking a dog that seemed more interested in the wind than in walking. People reading. People on their phones. People doing nothing in particular, which is a thing I'd forgotten was allowed. I watched a woman sitting on a blanket with a thermos and a paperback, and she was just reading, just sitting there in the thin morning sunlight with her thermos and her book. Not performing contentment. Not broadcasting anything. Just present in the way that people are when no one is watching and they have nowhere particular to be. I had been that person once. Before the relationship, before the city move, before the years of trying to be enough without knowing what enough looked like from the outside. I had been someone who could sit alone somewhere and feel, not lonely, but simply inhabited. Like the solitude was companionship of a different kind. I'd stopped being that person slowly. The way you stop being things when you're living in close proximity to someone who needs more from you than you know how to give, and you spend so much energy reaching toward them that you forget to stay tethered to yourself. I thought about Claire's email. I thought about the word she'd used, cage. I thought about the years I'd spent trying to unlock a cage that, as it turned out, had no lock. Just the idea of one. Believed in strongly enough to function the same way. I'm not angry about that. I want to be clear about that. Not performing equanimity. Actually not angry. Because I understood, sitting on that bench, that she'd been telling the truth the whole time. Not about me. About herself. She had felt trapped. That was real. She had needed something to change. That was real. What wasn't quite right was the diagnosis, that I was the source of it, that removing me would resolve it. But the pain underneath the diagnosis had been entirely genuine. And I had been, in my own ways, a difficult person to love well. Not cruel. Not distant. Just present in the wrong kind of way. There but not there. Reliable but not seen. And I think for someone who needed to be met, to feel the impact of who they were on another person, I must have felt, over time, like talking to a wall that politely asked follow-up questions. I needed to understand that about myself. Not to absolve her. Not to assign blame elsewhere. Just to know it. To carry it honestly. Nora came to visit at the start of month 5. She showed up with a bottle of wine and a bag of food, and spent the first 10 minutes saying appreciative things about the apartment, which I knew was partially genuine and partially her way of making sure I was actually okay before she asked if I was actually okay. You look different, she said. Good different or bad different? I asked. You look like you used to, she said. Before. I thought about that. When did I stop looking like that? I asked. Gradually, she said. And then all at once. We cooked together, which we hadn't done since we were young. She talked about her own life, her job, her apartment, a person she was tentatively seeing who made her laugh in a way she described as embarrassingly genuine. I talked about the work, about Derek, about the project I was building, which had started to feel like something I was proud of for the first time in a long time. We didn't talk about Claire until the second glass of wine, when Nora said carefully, "Is there anything left there?" "I don't know," I said. "That's not a yes or a no." "No," I said. "I know. I genuinely don't know." Which is the most honest answer I can give. She nodded. "Are you lonely?" she asked. I thought about that seriously. "Sometimes," I said. "But not in the same way I was before. Before I was lonely in a room with another person. Now I'm just, occasionally alone. It's different." "It is different," she said. "One of them is worse." "Yes," I said. "One of them is much worse." By month 6, something had settled. Not dramatically. Not with a single moment I could point to. But the newness of everything had softened into familiarity. I knew the good coffee shop on the corner. I knew the route that was fastest versus the route that was most pleasant. I had colleagues who had become something close to friends. Victor and I had started getting a drink on Friday evenings, a habit that began because we'd stayed late finishing a proposal and spiraled into something consistent. He was going through his own slow rearrangement, a divorce that was almost finalized, an apartment he was decorating with what he called the considered taste of a man who no longer has to share a remote control. We didn't talk about our personal lives in a deep way, more just the facts, the adjustments, the occasional observation that caught us both by surprise. One evening he said, "You know what the strange part of starting over is?" "Tell me," I said. "How normal it feels," he said. "You expect it to feel like wreckage, but it just feels like Tuesday." "Yeah," I said. "It does." He raised his glass. I raised mine. We went back to talking about work. That was enough. I had a routine that was mine, not built around someone else's rhythms or preferences or moods. I had an apartment that looked exactly like what I would choose if no one else had input. And I had work that meant something to me again. Not world-changing work. Not heroic. Just work I was good at, doing it well, being seen for it. That last part mattered more than I would have thought. Being seen. Not through drama. Not through absence. Not through proving something. Just seen. Noticed. Valued for the specific thing I was. Not the generically adequate partner I'd been trying to perform. Claire and I talk occasionally now. Not often. Not about the heavy things anymore. It's the kind of conversation you have with someone you once knew in a different version of your life. Careful, but not cold. Honest, but not raw. She's still in therapy. She moved into a smaller apartment. She got a promotion at the design firm, which she mentioned in passing and which I think she wasn't sure whether to tell me about. I told her I was glad. I meant it. She asked once, in a call maybe 2 months ago, whether I'd ever thought about coming back. To the city, she clarified. Not to her. She added that quickly. I said, maybe someday. But right now this is where I need to be. She said, I understand that. And I think she did. There's something I want to say about the silence. Not as a tactic. Not as advice for anyone going through something similar. Just as a thing I've come to understand about myself. I had spent 6 years believing that the way to hold something together was to keep talking. To keep reaching. To keep being available for every conversation, every emotional weather system, every renegotiation of what we were to each other. And I'd framed that as love. It was something, but it was also fear. Fear that if I stopped talking, stopped reaching, stopped filling every silence with effort, the whole thing would collapse. And I was right. It would have. But it would have collapsed because it needed to collapse. Not because I'd failed. Because some structures are held up by the frantic activity of one person preventing their natural settling. And when that person stops, not out of cruelty, not out of giving up, but out of finally accepting what is, the settling happens. And what settles is what was always going to settle. What remains is what was always going to remain. The silence didn't end my marriage. My marriage had already ended. The silence just stopped pretending otherwise. I'm writing this on a Sunday. It's raining outside. The park is mostly empty except for a few people with umbrellas and one man who seems to be deliberately not using one, just standing there with his face tilted up. I understand that man completely. There's something about standing in rain without resisting it that feels like an argument resolved. Like saying, yes, fine, this is what's happening, and I am here in it, and it doesn't require my management. I have coffee that's still hot. I have a book I'm halfway through that I'm genuinely invested in. I have a call with Derek later to go over a proposal I'm excited about. The wooden figure my father gave me is on the bookshelf. I've looked at it more in the last 6 months than I did in the previous 6 years. Not because I've been grieving. Just because it's visible now. It's where I can see it. That's all. I thought recently about a conversation Claire and I had years ago, early on, when things were still easy between us. We'd been talking about what we wanted our life to look like. Not in a serious planning way. Just talking. The way people do when they're new to each other and everything still feels possible. And she'd said, I want a life that surprises me. I want to wake up and not know exactly what the day is going to feel like. And I'd said, I want to wake up and know the person next to me. We'd laughed. But I think, looking back, that was the whole story. Right there. In those 2 sentences. We'd been aiming at different things from the beginning and calling it the same destination. And I don't know if that's tragedy or just life. Maybe it's both. Maybe some things are both. And in the morning, I have a new week. Mine. I don't know what comes next. I don't know if there's a version of the future that loops back. I don't know if the person I'm becoming will recognize himself in the person I was, or if that recognition will feel like grief or relief or something without a name. What I know is this. She looked at me and told me the truth. And I listened. Not the way I'd been listening for 6 years, cataloging, calculating, preparing my response, waiting to understand so I could fix. I just listened. And then I made the decision that truth required. And walked out of a life that had been dimming me, slowly, the way a window gets dirty. Not all at once. Just a little less light each season. Until you can barely see through it. Until you've forgotten that you used to be able to. Some people ask if I'm bitter. If I feel like I wasted years. And I think about that honestly. 6 years is not nothing. Leaving is not nothing. But bitterness requires believing that things should have been different. And I don't quite believe that. I believe they were what they were. I believe I was who I was. I believe she was exactly who she was. And I believe that sometimes 2 people can love each other genuinely and still be the wrong shape for each other's lives. Not because either of them is broken. Not because the love wasn't real. But because love, on its own, was never the whole answer. Not a tragedy. Not a failure. Just the truth. The kind that takes years to arrive at. The kind that doesn't make a sound when it finally lands. The kind that sits quietly in a kitchen doorway while the coffee goes cold and waits to be heard.